Welcome to A Fresh Start with Dr. Bobby Mullins, Executive Director of A Fresh Start Ministries. At some time, we all need a fresh start. And each week on A Fresh Start TV program, you'll hear a relevant message straight from the Bible, providing examples and principles to show us how to start over again. Join us now for this edition of A Fresh Start as Dr. Mullins proclaims from the Word of God how to live the abundant life Jesus desires for all of us to experience.
If you can't wait for each day to come to an end, you may feel God's forgotten you. Please let me remind you, my friend, Christ conquered sin and death, and He can take care of you. The tomb is still empty, and Jesus will see you through. The tomb is still empty. Jesus is Lord. He rose from the dead. He lives forevermore. Just trust and obey Him. He knows all you're praying for. The tomb is still empty, and He's always Lord. Let your heart not be troubled, though these are difficult times. The Lord knows what you're going through. You are always on His mind, and at the right moment, He'll lift the burden from you. For Jesus is Lord of all. That's why there's an empty tomb. The tomb is still empty. Jesus is Lord. He rose from the dead. He lives forevermore. Trust and obey Him. Christ knows all you're asking for. The tomb is still empty, and He's always Lord. The tomb is still empty. Jesus is Lord. The tomb is still empty, and Jesus is always Lord. I want to give you a little bit of background about how I came to that title, and then how I wrote that song. The church where I've been interim pastor, First Baptist Church at Strawberry Plains, goes in with a couple of churches in that area, and the three churches combine, and they put on a passion play. And at the passion play here a few months ago, one night when there's a pastor who participated, and when they asked him to come up at the end and give the plan of salvation and give people the opportunity to be saved. But one of the things he said, he was talking to Christians who live like Jesus didn't come out of the grave. They're saved, but then they're having so many problems in life, and they're looking in the wrong places to find help. And he said, hey folks, the tomb is still empty. In other words, Jesus rose again. Jesus is here with us. And that kind of caught my attention. But then I read an article here a while back that said that most people are just getting through today to get to tomorrow and hoping that it will be better. And that's why I wrote that first line, if you can't wait for each day to come to an end, you're wanting to get to tomorrow. And I know there are some of you who are watching A Fresh Start tonight that you may feel like God's forgotten you. Well, he hadn't. And I know as a minister that the tomb is empty and it has always been empty. But I know that there are people sometimes who you kind of forget that. You can trust in God, that God knows exactly what you're going through, and at the right moment, God will know when to lift you from it. But the key is this: are you trusting in God, and are you living for Him? And so that's the background there of the tomb. It's still empty. Now, I recently preached my 3,000th sermon, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the Lord's been pretty good to us as we've begun this program. We've been on with a Fresh Start for about a year now. And when we came on our first program, we mentioned that we're a faith ministry. I gave up my full-time pastorate in October of 2008. And so here I am 2 years later, and other than my interim pastorate, I've received some, a guaranteed weekly check for that. But for many months, we weren't guaranteed any income except what we get through the people who donate and support our ministry, and then some who've given us personally. Matter of fact, the day before I came in to tape this particular program that you're seeing tonight, an individual came up to my wife Wanda and gave her a little card, and she opened it up. There was $500 cash in there, and then $200 in a gift card to a grocery store. And these are folks who've just helped to support us through the last two years. A lot of people that way. I followed a principle I learned years ago from George Mueller, a great man of faith in the past. Mueller never specifically made his financial needs known to people, not even some of his requests that he needed for the orphanages that he built. But God always took care of it. And we're that same way. Now, it might come in time with my ministry or something like that. We're trying to do some type of project. We have a specific need. I might mention that to you. But personally, Wanda and I have just made it a goal in our life that we're going to trust the Lord first, and if we have a need, we're going to work. We're going to do what we need to do to earn the income needed or whatever, but when that's beyond what we can do, we trust God and He gets us through. But I do want to just you to bear with me as I need to make an appeal on our program for people to donate to our ministry. It takes money to live, and it takes money to minister. And Wanda and I were talking the other night, and about how difficult it is to ask people to give you money to support your ministry. And I said, well, Wanda, I guess in my 30 years in the ministry and even before that, I've never actually worked in a job where it was dependent on my sales to get commission or for the success of the company or whatever. I said, I've never really worked to earn money to make more money. I've been a school teacher, and you know how that goes, how they make their money off the taxes and so forth that people put into the government. But I said, we've always lived, particularly in the ministry, we were dependent upon people to give to our church through their tithes and offerings, and then that took care of our salary and other needs there. And it's the same way with the Fresh Start Ministries. So if you could give to our ministry, we would certainly be appreciative. You can give by check and send it to a Fresh Start Ministries, P.O. Box 32486, Knoxville, Tennessee 37930. Or you can go to my website, www.drbobbymullins.com, and there is a donations link, and it will explain to you exactly how you can give through a credit card or by giving through a check online. But thank you so much to those of you who have given, whether it's one time or you give regularly. God bless you, and that's why we're still able to be on the air. Now, I shared in a recent program that if I was asked, or I had decided what I wanted to preach for my 3,000th sermon, and then the next one or the one before, and then the 3,000, and had done two in one day, like 2,999, then 3,000, or 3,000 and 3,001, I would have picked two sermons on the life of Caleb. On a recent program, I shared what I titled, Looking Back with No Regrets. That's when Caleb was at 85 years of age. He'd been promised at age 40 that he was going to go into the promised land where God had wanted to send all the Israelites to go. And he was a man that when he got 85, it was obvious for the 45 years he waited, he had lived for the Lord. He could say he had wholly followed the Lord. He could say that Moses said he wholly followed the Lord. Joshua said he wholly followed the Lord. The people said he wholly followed the Lord. And God said of Caleb, you have wholly followed me. So he was a man who lived for God. And I preach that message looking back with no regrets, sometimes to senior adult groups, like on a senior adult Sunday. Because I can't think of anything that would be sadder than to get later in life and you look back and you have so many regrets about things that have happened. Well, again, even at 85, God will give you another opportunity. You can have a fresh start even if you're 85 years old. But I want to think of this more tonight, not looking back with no regrets, but looking ahead with great anticipation. Now, I like to preach that part of the message on the life of Caleb when I preach to a group of graduating seniors from high school or college. Because Caleb was one. Because of what he said when he was 85. I'm just as strong now. Yet these 40 years I've served God. It was obvious he had a plan when he was 40, which was young in life in those days. But at age 40, he could look ahead with great anticipation, even when God said to the 10 spies other than Joshua and Caleb, the 10 spies who said, we can't go in and defeat the giants in that land. And then the people wanted to turn on Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb and wanted to stone them to death and kill them. And in turning on those men, they were turning on God. When the people got to that point, Caleb stood up. And God said, Caleb and Joshua, your families will get into the promised land, but not the others. And so it took over 40 years for all the people to die out of those who were not going to be able to go into the promised land. Well, at 40 years of age, Caleb knew it was going to take time. But I want to tell you, he was able to look ahead with great anticipation to the day that it would happen. I don't know if he knew that he'd be twice as old, over twice as old, when he finally got his dream home, when he got his inheritance, when he was able to go into the promised land. But he looked ahead with great anticipation. And I just want to share with you some basic truths tonight based off the 14th chapter and other verses in the Bible. But the key is this. Caleb was able to go to Joshua. And man, he could boldly, with grace though, come before him and say in chapter 14 of Joshua, verse 7, 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me, and he could have said this, sent you and me, Joshua, along with 10 other spies to spy out the land. And I brought word about what was in my heart. But our brothers and sisters made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. And now the Lord has kept me alive these 45 years. I'm as strong now as I was then. He was a man who looked ahead with great anticipation, and he kept goals. He stayed in shape physically. He stayed in shape emotionally and mentally because he stayed in shape spiritually. But he was a man who fulfilled his goal and his dream in life. Verse 12, now therefore give me this mountain that I want to claim for my inheritance, because he wholly followed the Lord. And he went in and he claimed it. Well, here are just some statements I want to make based off the life of Caleb, that can help you to look forward with great anticipation. I mean, it's kind of interesting somehow. Sometimes 25-year-olds, well, I'm not married yet. 25's young today getting married. People are marrying later. I read things on Facebook from 18-year-olds and below like, oh, how tough life is. And a lot of times it's not about a whole lot of things, but it's just, you would think with them they're not going to, there's just not enough of life to live. They got their whole life before them. I want to tell you, look ahead with great anticipation. First of all, to be able to do that, you've got to remember this. It is better to stand alone with the truth than to be wrong with the multitude. You see, Caleb, at 85 years of age, would not have been able to go in and say, I want my mountain, I want my inheritance, I want my dream home, I want all these things for my family, if he hadn't stayed true to God. If when the spies came back, Caleb said, we can claim this territory. There are giants there, but God is with us. We can go in and defeat them. And Joshua was with him on it. But the other 10 spies said, no, they're too big. We need to go back to Egypt and go back and be in bondage and servitude again. At least we had food then. Well, God's promised land had much better food and quality of food and life than what they had as slaves. If Caleb then hadn't stood alone and had stood with the multitude, he would have died before he ever got to his promised land, to 85 years of age. Let me tell you, I don't care how young you are, you realize sometimes, usually, when you're standing with the crowd, a lot of times you're not standing with the right crowd. When you become a Christian, you know, it says in the Bible, broad is the way that leads to destruction. Narrow is the way that leads to the Lord. You're going to have to learn to live a narrow life if you're going to look ahead with great anticipation. There are going to be times when, again, the multitude, the crowd, won't stand for the truth, and you need to stand for the truth. Secondly, there's never a right way to do a wrong thing. You know, I was trying to think, oh, how can I illustrate that? And, you know, sometimes you seem to get a mental block, but I was just thinking how years ago when they first started getting handicap spots moved in, well, you didn't get fined at that time. And I remember one night they were on a news station, they were doing a segment about people who would park in the handicap spots who weren't handicapped. And so they all tried to justify why they were doing it. They would say, oh, I'm just running right in, I'm not even going to be 2 minutes. You know what the number one explanation was more than anything else? Well, all I know is this, the guy who was in the car before me wasn't handicapped, so they were trying to justify what they were doing because of something somebody else did wrong. There's never a right way to do a wrong thing, and now, of course, you can be fined if you park in a handicapped spot because so many people who weren't handicapped were using the handicapped spots. And so there's never a right way to do a wrong thing. Friend, it's always right to do right. And there are people in life who are there'll be a little something you might be able to do, and they said, oh, don't worry about that. Nobody's going to catch you. Well, somebody may catch you. You'd be surprised sometimes. I have known of people now with being able to text message something. They've just been with someone, they don't like what they say, and they text message and they think they're texting it to someone else, and they text it back to that person and said what they didn't want that person to hear them say. I tell you folks, it's always right to say the right thing, to do the right thing. So remember this, it is better to stand alone with the truth than to be wrong with the multitude, and there's never a right way to do a wrong thing. Then number 3, it's always too soon to quit. It's never too late to start. Man, I remember starting out in ministry when I didn't enter ministry full time until I was 30 years old. I traveled for 3 years out of college. I coached a couple of years. I tried to make it in country music for a year or two. And then when I finally got in ministry, I remember I worked with the pastor. Later on, I was full-time minister of youth at a church, and I worked with the pastor. And usually he would preach, a message right out of the Bible and all, but occasionally if he was teaching on a subject and it was more topical, he had this big notebook that he would bring with him like on a Wednesday night, and he'd open it up, and he had things by topics in there. And I remember the first time I looked at that minister's topical notebook that could help him. Wow, look at all this stuff. He could spend a lot of Wednesday nights being able to look at that notebook and teach on a certain topic. I thought, man, I look forward to I'm going to start doing that. When I first started, there was 1 article, 2 articles. Man, I never thought I'd get a notebook as thick as that pastor's with those topics. Do you know over the next 5 years, I filled several notebooks as a youth minister, as as I'd get an article and make a copy and put it in there and so forth. You got to start somewhere. Don't expect the first year you work on a job to be at the top of your game or to be better than others or to know more than everybody else or to be the most successful you're ever going to be. Just take it one day at a time, one step at a time. You know, there's the reason today many of my generation have gotten in debt and some below is because we wanted everything when we got married that it took our parents 25 years to attain. We wanted a bigger house than theirs. We wanted better cars and so forth, the quality of life, and a lot of them got themselves in debt. I mean, just take it one step at a time. Start where you need to start and then build upon that. It's always too soon to quit, but it's never too late to start. I know of some men who didn't get in the ministry till in their 40s and 50s, and God has used them in a marvelous way. I have a friend right now, I believe he's in his 70s, close to 80, who's working on a doctor of ministry at a seminary, and he's about to get it. Man, I like that. I don't want to ever get to the point I think I know enough and then not try to grow more. But it's always too soon to quit. It's never too late to start. You can think about athletic games where a team could be all 4 touchdowns behind in third or fourth quarter. Nobody thinks there's any way they could win that game, and man, they don't quit. They stay at it and they keep coming back and they eventually win the game, and it's that way in life. There have been some times in my life I've wanted to quit, but I tell you one thing my mother instilled in me. She said, I don't like quitters. And that was one thing in life. If I started out in something when I was a child, I remember I got in the junior choir, and I'm not knocking junior choir, but it kind of conflicted with playing sports at school and that sort of thing. And I was a 6th grader, so when I became a 7th grader, I couldn't be in junior choir. But I remember I didn't like junior choir after a while. But my mother said, no, you're going to stick it out and you're going to finish it this year because you got started with it. And that's the way it was with most everything that I did. She wanted to teach responsibility and to stay with something. And you know, there are some things that if I had quit when I wanted to and felt that wasn't what I needed to do, I eventually stuck with it, and man, I am so thankful later on. So never think you're at a quitting point. Never think that it's too late to start with something new. Another principle about how to look ahead with great anticipation. It's not how you begin, but how you end. That's one of the things my daughter's a singer, and you know, I do some singing, and the thing we always try to talk about, we may mess the song up sometime or maybe not hit a note during the song, but we always try to hit the right note at the end, and sometimes, you know, when it's a little high for you, it's hard to stay on that right note and all, but you see, because people remember what you end with, not necessarily where you started sometimes. I can think of some people who have been very successful in life, and I don't know why this is the guy that I remember, but at one time, Kenny Rogers was probably one of the most famous entertainers in the world. He and Dolly Parton, I remember they did a concert from the football stadium in Detroit that looked like it was packed to me. I mean, he was the top entertainer in the world. And Kenny Rogers, I have nothing against him. I still think he's a good entertainer. I like to hear his songs. But I was at a UT football game, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And we were only 3 rows from the visiting team, which was from another state. And there were some co-eds, some college student girls who had too much to drink. And you know, they were saying things and not paying a whole lot of attention. Well, at halftime, I remember Kenny Rogers was the halftime guest, and so he was down there and he was singing and all, and finally one of the co-eds, she finally realized somebody was singing. She goes, "Who's that?" And one of the other fans, an older guy about my age, said, "Oh, that's Kenny Rogers." She said, "Who?" You know, I just couldn't get over it. I thought, my goodness, the decade before, he's one of the most famous entertainers in the world, friends. It's not how you begin, it's how you end. I'm thankful with Kenny, he's still staying with it. Because who knows, there's some who have a second career and do better even later on in life than when they started early in life. But it's not how you begin, it's how you end. Stay with it. Make sure that you end strong. Number 5, Everything about your life can change for the better overnight. In one day, David went from being a shepherd boy to being a king. Now, he wasn't living like a king, but he was crowned, he was anointed as king, and it took about 7 years before he could really start living as a king, but it happened overnight. And there are situations like that that happened. Joseph, he was in prison, and in one day, overnight, he went from the prison to a palace, from being a prisoner to being second in command over all of Egypt. Everything about your life can change for the better overnight. You know, some of you may be in a situation, oh, I need a fresh start. It's about there. Make sure you're living life the way you should. Make sure you're one who's wholly following God, because in just a moment your life can change. You might get that job you've been praying for. You might get an opportunity that you've been praying and asking God for, and it happens just in one day. You see, with Caleb, for 45 years he waited. Finally he went and asked for it. He did it properly. He did it respectfully. He went and asked Joshua, now, if I can go claim my inheritance, and it happened. That day he was able to do that. Number 6, it's seldom someone is successful who runs with the crowd, but it's someone who stands apart from the status quo. I mean, throughout the Bible you see examples of those who stood for Christ. Sometimes it resulted in their death. But I tell you what, Caleb didn't run with the crowd. That's why he was able to go into the promised land when everybody else wanted to stone him to death, when they all said, we can't do this, but he said, we can with God on our side. Caleb wasn't with the crowd that day. And as a result, Caleb got his dream home. Caleb got his mountain. He got his inheritance for his family because he actually stood against the crowd. It's seldom someone is successful who runs with the crowd, but it's someone who stands apart from the status quo. And then number 7, we've talked about it's better to stand alone with the truth than to be wrong with the multitude. There's never a right way to do a wrong thing. It's always too soon to quit. It's never too late to start. It's not how you begin, it's how you end. Everything about your life can change for the better overnight. It's seldom someone is successful who runs with the crowd, but it's someone who stands apart from the status quo. Number 7, lay out your life as if you'll live a full lifetime, but live in a way that if the Lord came at any moment, you would not be embarrassed. Folks, that's exactly what Caleb did when he looked ahead with great anticipation when he was 40 years of age, and then when he was 85 and he claimed his inheritance. He lived every day as if he'd live a full lifetime, but he wholly followed the Lord. He lived in a way that his life would not bring embarrassment to the Lord in any way. Can you do it? Absolutely. And I encourage you, put Christ first in your life. My truth will set you free. For He's the truth, the life, the way. And if you'll believe